I'm Alex, and this video features rich climbers who were going to die, and their Sherpas already knew it. From TikToker, who attempted a solo ascent and was halted by a growing storm, to a former wealth manager who paid $400,000 for a private summit attempt, pausing for photos on the Lhotse face while her oxygen dwindled. It was February 14th, 2015, at Everest Base Camp. The North Col route faced pre-monsoon storm conditions, with gale-force winds and bitter cold. Snow whipped across the exposed ridges. Visibility was near zero, and prayer flags snapped violently against the white backdrop. At this altitude, even minor missteps could be fatal. Among the climbers preparing that morning was Brianna Hastings, 31, a Boston-based corporate compliance manager. She had no winter or high-altitude mountaineering experience, and relied entirely on previous mild-season guided treks. Hastings approached the climb with a mindset shaped by control and dominance. She believed confidence and mental toughness could override the mountain's rules. Posted advisories and repeated warnings from guides emphasized that ascending alone in current conditions was life-threatening. Hastings ignored these cautions, insisting on proceeding without supplemental guidance, framing the expedition as proof she could master challenges others feared. As she moved above the upper camps, the climb became increasingly hazardous. Trail markers were obscured by fresh snow and wind, leaving her dependent on memory and limited GPS navigation. Spindrift, fine wind-blown snow, penetrated every layer of clothing, wetting insulation and reducing its effectiveness. Ice crystals formed on her gloves and face protection, impairing dexterity and making even simple movements, like adjusting backpack straps or holding trekking poles, difficult. Every step required careful placement on hidden rock or ice, but poor visibility made footing unreliable. By early afternoon, gusts approaching 90 miles per hour struck without warning, catching Hastings off balance on an exposed ridge. She stumbled into shallow depressions between boulders as trekking poles were ripped from her hands and her backpack waist belt tore under wind pressure, eliminating her main points of stability. Snow blew into her face, freezing against goggles and mask, and visibility dropped to near zero. Each successive gust drove her further along the slope, increasing contact with snow and ice, while wet clothing accelerated the loss of body heat. Hastings attempted to activate her GPS emergency beacon, but frost-numb fingers prevented proper operation. The device slipped from her grasp and became partially buried in snow. For the next 40 minutes, she crawled between rock outcrops and small ridges, seeking shelter from the full force of the wind. Hypothermia progressed rapidly. Uncontrollable shivering gave way to loss of fine motor control, confusion, and impaired decision-making. Attempts to call for help were incoherent, and she became increasingly disoriented regarding position and descent direction. Eventually, Hastings could no longer move, unable to maintain balance or recognize safe terrain. Breathing slowed and became shallow as hypothermia affected cardiovascular and neurological function. Consciousness faded while she attempted to use her phone, unaware that the device had no reception. Even minor movements like turning her head or shifting weight required immense effort. By the time rescuers reached her location the following morning, she was found unresponsive, partially shielded by boulders but fully exposed to the storm. Her climbing partner contacted base camp hours after she failed to check in. Extreme winds, steep terrain, and ongoing storm conditions initially made rescue impossible. Once teams reached her, the body was partially buried under wind-deposited snow. The medical examiner determined severe hypothermia as the cause of death, with exhaustion and dehydration as contributing factors. The GPS beacon was recovered nearby, but would not have enabled timely rescue under the conditions. The incident highlighted the extreme hazards of winter climbing on Everest. Exposure to sub-zero temperatures, high winds, and blowing snow can overwhelm even physically strong climbers. Confidence, social media goals, or prior fitness cannot replace preparation, adherence to guide instructions, or respect for the mountain's limits. In extreme conditions, rescue options are extremely limited, leaving little room for error. It was April 18th, 2016. The trail from Lukla climbs northeast along the Dudkoshi River, gaining altitude through pine forest and stone-walled villages before the trees thin and the rock takes over. The river runs below, gray-green and loud with snowmelt, audible from the trail, but rarely visible for long. By day 4 of the approach, the expedition team was already above 9,000 feet. The air was thinner than most of the climbers had ever breathed outside of an airplane cabin, and it showed. Legs burned on flat ground. Rest stops came more frequently than they had 3 days before. Trace Albright, 51, a semi-retired structural engineer from Boise, Idaho, had done this before. He was on his second attempt at Everest's South Col route, and he knew the approach the way a driver knows a long road. Not fondly, but with the particular competence of someone who has already made the primary mistakes. He kept a journal throughout the expedition. The habit had served him on his first attempt, grounding him through the long recovery days and the stretches of altitude-induced sleeplessness, and he saw no reason to stop. Dax Welford, 44, walked ahead of him most of that 4th day, or tried to. Welford was a commercial real estate developer from Houston, Texas, who had built a mid-sized portfolio of industrial and retail properties across the Gulf Coast region over roughly 2 decades. He had paid $85,000 for a guided summit package through an established Kathmandu-based guiding agency. The package included equipment support, supplemental oxygen, Sherpa assignment, fixed rope access along the South Col route, and all meals from base camp upward. It was his first expedition to the Himalayas, and, by his own accounting delivered to anyone within range of his satellite phone, it would not take long. On day 4, he told someone back in Houston that he would be standing on the summit in 3 weeks, maybe less. Albright overheard the call. He noted it that evening in his journal, later referenced in testimony, that Welford seemed to be approaching the mountain the way he likely approached a property acquisition, a transaction with a predictable close date and clear deliverables. Would the mountain prove as negotiable as a property deal? Foaming Norgay was 38 years old and from Fortsay, a village in the Khumbu Valley situated at roughly 12,730 feet, where generations of Sherpa families have lived close enough to Everest to watch its plume of wind-driven snow from the rooftops on clear days. He had reached Everest's summit 6 times by the spring of 2016. He supported 3 children and an aging father on the income generated across the climbing seasons. He was widely regarded within the professional climbing community of the Khumbu, guides, logistics operators, icefall doctors, base camp staff, as precise, professional, and undemonstrative. He was not known for complaint or for drawing attention to himself. He carried 55 pounds of client gear up the approach trail. He said very little. On day 4 of the approach, somewhere on the river trail between Phakding and Namche Bazaar, Dax Welford snapped his fingers at Foaming Norgay to get his attention. Albright saw it happen. He said nothing. Foaming adjusted the load on his back and kept walking. The first clean sightline of Everest's south face opens near Namche Bazaar, a trading hub at around 11,300 feet that functions as the last substantial settlement before the high country begins in earnest. The mountain appears at a distance as a dark triangular mass, its upper flanks carrying a horizontal plume of snow, driven off the summit ridge by winds that can exceed 100 miles per hour. Could the mountain's looming presence foreshadow the human tensions climbing with it? Everest rises to 29,032 feet, where air pressure and oxygen drop to about 1/3 of sea level. The body adapts slowly, producing extra red blood cells over weeks of high altitude exposure. Base camp sits at 17,600 feet on the Khumbu Glacier's lateral moraine. Towering seracs up to 50 feet crack and groan nightly as the glacier shifts, forcing climbers to either sleep through it or go sleepless. Albright noted in his journal that arriving at base camp on his first attempt had felt like arriving at an edge. Not the romantic version, but the plainly literal one, where the familiar stops and something else begins. Expedition head guide Rajan Chetri, 46, was from Kathmandu and had reached Everest's summit 11 times by the spring of 2016. He gathered the full expedition team on the day of base camp arrival, 9 climbers and 7 Sherpas. His briefing covered the rotation schedule, oxygen management, radio protocols, emergency procedures, and conduct expectations. The conduct section was brief. That afternoon, during the equipment check, Foaming Norgay repacked Dax Welford's summit bag, a standard Sherpa practice as proper weight distribution above 26,000 feet affects balance, fatigue, and survival. Welford took the bag, called Foaming the help, and no one responded, though 2 Sherpas heard him. Could disrespect in the death zone carry consequences heavier than any bag? Everest acclimatization follows a strict, non-negotiable pattern. Climb high, sleep high, descend to recover, repeating over weeks to build red blood cells for the death zone. Many deaths occur when climbers rush this process. The Khumbu Icefall, just above base camp, is a 2,000-foot cascade of shifting ice moving 3 to 4 feet per day. The route, maintained by Icefall doctors, uses ladders across deep crevasses. Climbers cross in crampons, often before dawn, while towering seracs can fall without warning. It's the deadliest South Col section. More fatalities happen here than on the summit ridge. Rajan Chetri noted it matter-of-factly, like describing a tricky highway interchange. Dax Welford moved through the icefall faster than the pace Chetri set for the team. Speed in the icefall is not an advantage. It means longer exposure under seracs, less precision on the ladder crossings, and a physiological burn rate incompatible with the 16-plus hours that would be required above 26,000 feet later in the expedition. Chetri flagged it. Welford dismissed him and kept moving. During a rest stop at Camp 1, at 19,900 feet, Albright asked Foaming how many times he had crossed the Khumbu Icefall over his career. Foaming considered the question. He estimated approximately 90 crossings. He had first crossed it at 19 years old, carrying loads for an expedition he was not summiting with. He had not owned his own climbing gear then. He did not own it now. The agency supplied it. Could sheer experience truly counter reckless decisions made by others? The second rotation of the acclimatization cycle brought the team to Camp 3 at 24,500 feet, in a section known as the Yellow Band, a visible geological stratum of pale limestone that was oceanic seafloor before the Indian subcontinent collided with Asia and compressed the sediment upward over tens of millions of years. The rock holds marine fossils at nearly 25,000 feet above sea level. Climbers move past them clipped to fixed ropes, with the Lhotse face dropping thousands of feet below their crampon points. Wind at this altitude is consistent and physical. It leans into a person rather than pushing at them intermittently. On the ascent to Camp 3, Welford became aggressively argumentative during a rest stop. He directed the agitation at Foaming, accusing him of slowing the group's pace. Albright recorded the exchange in his journal. Chetri pulled Welford aside and spoke privately. What Chetri said during that conversation was not documented. Welford's response was audible to nearby climbers. He had paid for a summit, not a babysitter. Hypoxia impairs cognition and emotional control before obvious physical symptoms appear, causing irritability, poor judgment, and uncharacteristic aggression. At 24,500 feet without supplemental oxygen, all climbers experience measurable cognitive decline. But Welford's behavior had begun at 9,000 feet, long before altitude became a factor. During the recovery at base camp, Chetri emphasized high-calorie intake to offset extreme caloric burn at altitude. Welford used his satellite phone and ate inconsistently. Foaming noticed fraying on a fixed rope near Camp 2, reported it to Chetri, and it was replaced before the next rotation. Would small, careful interventions be enough to prevent catastrophe? On May 19, 2016, the meteorological window confirmed by forecasting services in Kathmandu aligned with the expedition's acclimatization timeline. The final push began. The South Col is a quarter-mile-wide saddle between Everest and Lhotse, littered with rock and ice, exposed to relentless jet stream winds that shred tents each season. Above 26,000 feet in the death zone, the body consumes muscle for energy. Vision fades, cognition slows, and coordination fails. Physiological inevitabilities for all climbers. Summit day exposure often lasts 16 to 22 hours. Welford was placed on supplemental oxygen at Camp 4 as scheduled. He set his flow rate at 2 liters per minute. The standard rate for guided expedition, clients on the South Col route, runs between 3 and 4 liters per minute during the summit push. The supplemental oxygen system used on Everest mixes bottled oxygen with ambient air through the mask. It does not deliver pure oxygen. At 2 liters per minute at 26,300 feet, the effective oxygen environment experienced by a climber is roughly equivalent to an altitude of approximately 24,000 feet, still well inside the death zone's physiological damage range, and substantially below the margin built into the expedition's planning. Foaming Norgay noticed Welford's flow setting. He reported it to Chetri. Chetri adjusted the rate upward while Welford slept. Welford woke before the summit push, discovered the change, and turned it back to 2 liters per minute. This was the first documented instance of foaming intervening directly for Welford's physical safety and being overruled. Would intervention be enough when the climber refuses help? Suki Vang, 29, a nurse from Minneapolis, was at Camp 4 simultaneously with a separate guided expedition. It was her first 8,000-meter peak. She and Albright exchanged a few words near the tent lines during the preparation period. She noted the tension visible in Welford's group. It was, in her later description, apparent even from the outside. Something in the body language, the spacing between team members, the way Foaming and Welford occupied the same space. At Camp 4, the second major incident between Welford and Foaming occurred in front of multiple witnesses. Foaming was fitting Welford's oxygen mask before the summit departure. At approximately -30 degrees Fahrenheit in wind, wearing expedition-weight gloves built for warmth rather than dexterity, fitting an oxygen mask is a slow and tactile process. The mask must seat properly against the face. Any gap in the seal reduces the effective oxygen delivery rate. The fitting was taking time. Welford struck Foaming's hands away from the mask. The action was observed by Albright, Chitri, Vang from approximately 40 feet away, and Sherpas from both expeditions in the adjacent area. Welford told Foaming to carry the bags. Foaming stepped back. He said nothing. Chitri asked Foaming privately whether he wanted to rotate off the summit team. The grounds existed. The conduct Foaming had absorbed across the weeks of the expedition would have been sufficient justification to withdraw from the assignment. Foaming declined. He told Chitri they were close to the top and he would finish the job. The team departed Camp 4 at 11 p.m. on May 19th. Temperature at the South Col was approximately -40 degrees Fahrenheit, with consistent wind within the forecasted range for the weather window. Midnight starts are standard on the South Col route. The timing provides maximum margin for a summit arrival before 10 a.m., with adequate remaining daylight for the descent. Would the darkness conceal risks that daylight would reveal? The headlamps of 9 climbers and their Sherpas formed a broken line moving upward along the triangular face in full darkness. Crampons bit into ice over rock. At -40 degrees with an oxygen mask on, conversation is an expenditure most climbers stop making early. The fixed ropes disappeared upward into darkness above each headlamp cone. The balcony at 27,600 feet is the first formal checkpoint on summit day, a broad ledge on the southeast ridge used for oxygen assessment and team evaluation. Chitri documented the team's condition there in the expedition record. Welford's pace on the ascent to the balcony was fast, notably so for a client at that altitude on his first high-altitude expedition. Chitri's record flags the pace as a concern. At extreme altitude, speed is not an advantage over consistency. Moving fast burns the body's remaining glucose at an accelerated rate and produces the kind of exhaustion that, above 28,000 feet, can become terminal. The climbers with the highest survival rates at extreme altitude are frequently those who move slowly and without interruption. Suki Vang's team had departed Camp 4 45 minutes after Welford's group. Her team's pace placed her close enough to observe what followed and far enough behind to remain outside the direct hazard zone. The south summit at 28,700 feet marks the beginning of the most cognitively depleted portion of the climb. At this altitude, processing information requires measurably more time. Spatial judgment degrades. The automatic decision-making experience climbers rely on becomes unreliable in ways that are not subjectively obvious. The climber experiencing impairment does not typically recognize the extent of it. Could unnoticed cognitive decline become a fatal misstep? Albright described his own mental state near the south summit in later testimony as resembling the experience of thinking through wet sand. He reported misjudging a step on the fixed rope and Foaming reaching back to steady him without a word, without breaking his own movement. The Hillary Step, a 40-foot near-vertical rock and ice wall at 28,840 feet, is the South Col route's final technical obstacle. It creates a geographic bottleneck where climbers ascending must yield to descending parties, who are often most exhausted and have limited options on the face. A climber from a separate expedition was descending the Hillary Step as Welford's team ascended. Welford did not yield. He moved into the descending climber's space on the feature. Foaming reached forward and guided Welford back to a hold, a physical correction on a near-vertical face at 28,800 feet that almost certainly prevented one or both climbers from losing their footing. Welford shoved Foaming. Foaming caught his fixed rope. He did not fall. In the impact, His oxygen mask was knocked partially loose from the seal against his face. Albright was directly below on the fixed rope. He watched the shove happen. He was close enough to see Foaming catch the rope and reach up with one gloved hand to attempt to reseat the mask against his face while remaining clipped to the line. He heard Welford say something into the wind. He could not make out the words through his own mask and the ambient noise at that altitude. Above them, Chetri had not seen the shove directly. From his position higher on the route, Foaming's momentary stop looked like an oxygen equipment check. Would anyone truly understand the severity of what had just happened? The team continued upward. No one called a halt. Every witness who later gave testimony described this as the moment they could not fully explain. The team reached the summit in the gray pre-dawn light that arrives at 29,032 feet before it reaches the valleys below. The sky held no color worth describing. The exposure was total. The horizon curves visibly from the summit on a clear morning, the Earth's geometry apparent to the naked eye. Wind was present, but within the survival margin. There was no ceremony. Welford took a photograph. It was recovered later from his camera. The descent began within 20 minutes of arriving at the top. The weather window had been narrowing since before they reached the summit. Chetri set the pace downward. On the descent from the summit toward the south summit, Foaming Norgay's pace declined. It was not abrupt. Climbers slow on descent from exhaustion, from accumulated hypoxia, from the physical cost of 18+ hours above 26,000 feet. No one identified the deceleration as medical in those first minutes. But by the time the route brought the team near the south summit, the gap between Foaming and the climbers ahead of him had widened past what normal fatigue explained. Could anyone recognize the warning signs before it was too late? Foaming sat down on the ridge near the south summit. He did not call out or indicate distress. He stopped moving forward and sat. Albright, descending behind him, asked if he was all right. Foaming nodded. He attempted to stand. He could not coordinate his legs to execute it. Chetri was radioed from below and climbed back up. He examined Foaming's oxygen equipment. The mask seal had been compromised since the Hillary step. The mask, knocked loose in the collision with Welford and partially receded by Foaming, with one hand while clipped to the rope at 28,800 feet, had not held a proper seal. Across the 90 minutes of continued ascent, the summit stop, and the beginning of the descent, continuing to move at extreme altitude, continuing to physically steady other members of the team, Foaming had been breathing air that leaked around an improperly seated mask seal. The oxygen his system was rated to supply had not been fully reaching him. The gap between what his body required and what it received, over 90 minutes at that altitude while under physical load, had compounded into collapse. Chetri's radio transmission to base camp was recovered with the expedition records. The base camp operators who received it described his voice as controlled and shaking in the same breath. Could calmness in crisis conceal the urgency of a life-or-death situation? The ledge near the south summit at 28,700 feet is barely wide enough to sit safely. Chetri and Albright stabilized Foaming, who was conscious but unable to stand or follow instructions. His fingers were unresponsive, and his lips were cyanotic, a sign of severe oxygen deficiency. His symptoms matched high-altitude cerebral edema, or HACE, where brain swelling impairs motor and cognitive function. At that altitude, no medication can reverse it. The only chance of survival is immediate descent. But Foaming could not move. Dax Welford was below the ledge on the descent route, continuing downward. Albright called toward him. Welford kept moving. Chetri radioed base camp. The transcript was later obtained by journalists covering the season. He gave coordinates and described Foaming's symptoms with the specificity of someone trained to communicate under this kind of pressure. Base camp advised assisted descent and provided what guidance was possible. Helicopter rescue above approximately 23,000 feet is not operationally feasible under standard conditions on the Nepalese side of the range. Could guidance alone save a man too high for rescue? Suki Vang's team reached the south summit during this period. Vang was the only medically trained person at that location on the mountain at that time. She confirmed the symptom profile. She and one of her Sherpas joined Chetri and Albright in the effort to move Foaming downward. Moving an incapacitated person at 28,700 feet is not a rescue operation in any conventional sense. The people making the attempt are operating well inside their own physiological limits. Each person is managing oxygen supply, balance, cognitive deterioration, and the physical demand of moving another body down technical terrain at near the edge of survivable altitude. They are doing this without rest, without warmth, without adequate fuel. The group moved foaming approximately 200 vertical feet downward over 90 minutes. At some point during that descent, no witness could later identify the exact moment. Foaming Norgay lost consciousness. He did not regain it. Foaming Norgay was declared dead at approximately 27,600 feet, the balcony, at around 3:30 p.m. on May 20th, 2016. He had been on the mountain for 16 hours. He was 38 years old. In her written testimony submitted to the expedition agency and the journalists who covered the story, Suki Vang described his death in a single sentence. He did not scream, he did not fight, he simply stopped. Dax Welford reached Camp 4 on the South Col ahead of the rest of the team. He radioed base camp to confirm his summit and report that he was safe. He did not mention Foaming Norgay in the transmission. He did not describe any of the events that had occurred above the South Summit. Camp 4 at 26,300 feet is survivable under correct conditions. Functioning supplemental oxygen, a properly sealed shelter, adequate caloric reserves, rest, and a body that has not been subjected to 9 or 10 continuous hours of death zone exposure on an inadequate oxygen supply. Welford had been running at 2 liters per minute since the previous night at Camp 4. Against the direct guidance of his lead guide and against the active intervention of Foaming Norgay, he had maintained that rate through the entirety of the summit push and descent. Within approximately 1 hour of Welford's arrival at Camp 4, a support Sherpa from a neighboring expedition noticed that Welford's tent had not been properly sealed against the wind, a condition that, at 26,300 feet and driven cold, is not cosmetic. He approached the tent to address it. He found Welford unresponsive inside. Welford's oxygen tank was empty. Whatever cerebral deterioration had been building across the summit day, through 9 to 10 hours of inadequate supplemental oxygen at extreme altitude, through sustained physical exertion, including a shove at 28,800 feet, through the full length of the ascent and descent, had reached a point beyond which the body could sustain basic function. The arrival at Camp 4 had not reversed what the death zone had already done. A Sherpa from the neighboring expedition attempted CPR at 26,300 feet with a body depleted by a full summit day on insufficient oxygen and the probable onset of cerebral edema. Resuscitation was not achievable by any means available on the South Col. The attempt was made regardless. Dax Welford was pronounced dead at Camp 4 South Col. He was 44 years old. Albright arrived at Camp 4 shortly afterward, descending with Chetri's group. He found Welford already dead. He recorded in his journal that he stood at the tent entrance and did not feel what he had expected to feel. He did not authorize the journal entry to be reproduced. Dax Welford's body was recovered from Camp 4 by a Sherpa team contracted through the guiding agency and transported by helicopter to Lukla, from which repatriation to Houston was arranged through a publicist retained by the family. The obituary that appeared in the Houston business press described his 2 decades in commercial real estate development, his drive, and his love of outdoor challenges. It did not describe the events of May 19th and 20th, 2016, on the South Col route. It did not mention Foaming Norgay. Foaming Norgay's body could not be recovered from 27,600 feet without placing additional climbers at unreasonable risk. Per the wishes of his family, and consistent with the tradition maintained in the Sherpa community for those who die on the high routes, he was left on the mountain. A ceremony was held in Fortsey village. His 3 children attended. He was the 11th member of the Fortsey community to die on Everest. It was June 12th, 2016, and Maya Rodriguez sat in her Los Angeles apartment, scrolling through her phone after an evening fitness session. At 31 years old, she had built a modest following of 180,000 on Instagram by posting fitness content, marathon training updates, and motivational quotes overlaid on photos of herself mid-workout. The algorithm had been generous that evening, serving her a TikTok video that had gone viral across multiple platforms. An amateur climber standing on what appeared to be the summit of Mount Everest, arms raised in triumph, with a caption suggesting that anyone with determination could achieve the same feat. Maya watched the video 3 times. The climber in the footage had no apparent sponsorships, no elite athletic background mentioned in the bio, just a regular person who had decided to climb the world's tallest mountain and succeeded. The comment section overflowed with praise and declarations from viewers promising they would attempt their own climbs. Maya screenshot the video and spent the next 2 hours researching high-altitude mountaineering. Her fitness background was legitimate within its context. She had completed 6 marathons with respectable times, maintained a rigorous strength training schedule, and possessed the cardiovascular endurance that came from years of disciplined exercise. What she did not possess was any technical climbing experience beyond a single weekend rock climbing course she had taken 4 years earlier at an indoor gym. She had never used crampons on ice, never climbed above 10,000 feet, and never spent a night in temperatures below freezing. The research she conducted that evening did not fill these gaps. Instead, it reinforced a belief that physical fitness and mental toughness could substitute for experience. Over the following week, Maya's search history revealed a pattern of misunderstanding about high-altitude mountaineering. She searched for the easiest 8,000-meter peaks and found articles listing mountains by technical difficulty. Everest appeared frequently, but was described as overcrowded and expensive. K2 appeared in several articles as more challenging, but with fewer commercial expeditions and lower permit costs. What Maya absorbed from these articles was that K2 was less crowded, not that it was statistically more dangerous than Everest, with a summit-to-fatality ratio that had historically hovered near 25%. She contacted 6 expedition companies by email, describing her fitness background and requesting information about joining a K2 expedition that summer. 5 companies responded with polite rejections or recommendations that she first gain experience on lower peaks like Aconcagua, Denali, or at minimum, a 6,000-meter trekking peak in Nepal. The 6th company, a small Pakistani outfit based in Islamabad, responded with a quote of $72,000 and a questionnaire asking about her insurance coverage and medical history. The questionnaire did not ask about prior climbing experience in any specific detail. Maya interpreted the company's willingness to accept her as validation that her fitness level was sufficient. She paid the deposit on June 18th and received a gear list 3 days later. The list included items she had never heard of: ascenders, Prusik loops, glacier glasses with specific UV protection ratings, and down suits rated for extreme cold. She spent $9,000 at an outdoor retailer in Los Angeles, relying on sales staff recommendations for equipment selection because she did not understand the differences between models or temperature ratings. When the employee asked about her prior climbs to help select appropriate gear, Maya mentioned her marathon experience and said she was preparing for a high-altitude expedition. The employee did not ask which mountain. Maya departed for Pakistan on June 24, 2016, and arrived in Islamabad on June 26th after a connecting flight through Dubai. The expedition leader, a Pakistani guide named Tariq Hussain, met her and 3 other clients at the hotel for an initial briefing. The other clients had varying experience levels. One had summited Everest, another had attempted K2 previously and turned back at Camp 3, and the third had multiple 6,000-meter summits across the Andes and Himalayas. When introductions were made, Maya and Tariq asked about her climbing background. She described her fitness routine and mentioned she had researched high-altitude physiology extensively over the past 2 weeks. Tariq's expression suggested concern, but the payment had already cleared, and the liability waiver she had signed in Los Angeles was comprehensive. The approach to K2 base camp took 6 days of trekking from Oscole through the Baltoro Glacier, and Maya struggled more than anticipated. The trail demanded sustained hiking at elevations between 10,000 and 16,000 feet while carrying a day pack, with porters managing the heavier loads. By the 3rd day, Maya experienced persistent headaches and nausea that she attributed to dehydration rather than altitude. When she mentioned this to Tariq during an evening meal, he explained that her symptoms matched classic acute mountain sickness and that her body needed more time to adjust to the elevation. Maya responded that she would feel better once they stopped moving and established base camp. They reached K2 base camp on June 28th at 16,400 feet, where temperatures hovered near freezing even in direct sunlight, and wind tore across the Godwin-Austen Glacier, with enough force to require anchoring tents with heavy rocks and buried gear. The camp sprawled across a rocky moraine, with approximately 35 climbers from 5 different expeditions preparing for potential summit windows in July. Prayer flags stretched between tent clusters, snapping violently in gusts that carried the smell of kerosene from camp stoves and the sharp ozone scent of glacial ice. Maya was assigned to work with Verba Chering, a 41-year-old Sherpa from Kumjung village in Nepal's Khumbu region. Furba had worked as a high-altitude guide for 19 years and had summited K2 4 times and Everest 9 times, placing him among the more experienced Sherpa guides working in the Karakoram. He was known within the climbing community as patient with inexperienced clients, but firm about safety protocols and turnaround times, especially on mountains where margins for error were thin. His income from guiding supported his wife, 4 children, and his elderly mother, whose respiratory issues required ongoing medical care that consumed a significant portion of his annual earnings. The expedition company had hired Furba specifically for Maya after Tariq expressed concerns about her lack of experience. The plan called for Furba to provide one-on-one support throughout the climb, focusing exclusively on Maya while other Sherpas worked with the remaining clients. When Furba first met Maya in the mess tent on June 29th, he asked about her prior climbs to understand her technical skill level. Maya described her fitness background and mentioned she had been training intensely. Furba clarified by asking specifically about ice climbing, crampon use, and fixed rope ascent techniques. Maya acknowledged she had no practical experience with those skills, but said she learned quickly and had watched instructional videos. Furba spent the afternoon teaching Maya basic crampon techniques on a small ice slope near camp. The lesson revealed significant gaps in her coordination and understanding. She crossed her feet while traversing, a dangerous habit that could cause her to trip over her own crampons. Her ice axe technique was tentative and incorrect, and she did not understand the difference between French technique and front pointing. After 2 hours, Furba had covered material that experienced climbers learned during multi-day courses, and he recognized that Maya's learning curve would not flatten quickly enough to make her safe on K2's technical terrain. That evening, Furba spoke privately with Tariq about his concerns. Maya's lack of experience meant she was not simply inexperienced, she was unqualified for K2 by any reasonable standard. The mountain demanded technical proficiency on steep ice, sustained effort in the death zone above 26,000 feet, and decision-making capacity under severe hypoxia. Tariq acknowledged the concerns, but noted that Maya had signed extensive liability waivers and that the company had accepted her payment with the understanding she was climbing at her own risk. Furba understood the economics that governed these decisions, even when they conflicted with safety. The first briefing occurred on July 1st, when Tariq gathered all expedition members to review the route, acclimatization schedule, and objective hazards. He explained that K2's weather windows were narrower and less predictable than Everest's, that rescue above Camp 3 was extremely difficult, and that turnaround times existed specifically to prevent climbers from descending in darkness, when exhaustion and hypoxia made fatal errors more likely. Maya attended the briefing with her phone positioned to record video, and she interrupted twice to ask Tariq to repeat sections because she had been filming rather than listening. When Furba explained the importance of efficient movement through dangerous terrain, like the bottleneck, a steep couloir beneath a massive hanging serac, where speed reduced exposure to collapse, Maya asked whether they could pause during that section so she could capture footage. Furba explained patiently that stopping in objective hazard zones increased risk for everyone on the mountain, not just her. Maya responded that her followers expected content throughout the climb, and she needed to document key sections. The first acclimatization rotation began on July 3rd, with a climb from base camp to Camp 1 at approximately 19,700 feet. The route ascended steep scree and ice slopes for nearly 3,000 vertical feet, and most experienced climbers completed the climb in 4 to 5 hours. Maya required 7 hours and 15 minutes. Furba stayed with her throughout, watching her struggle with terrain that should have felt manageable for someone attempting K2. Her breathing became labored within the first hour, and she stopped frequently to rest even on moderate slopes. Her crampon technique remained poor despite the previous day's practice, and twice she caught her front points on her opposite pant leg and nearly lost balance. At Camp 1, Furba checked Maya's oxygen saturation using his pulse oximeter. The reading showed 76%, which fell within acceptable range for acclimatization, but was lower than ideal for someone at this early stage. He asked about her hydration and whether she had experienced headaches or nausea during the climb. Maya acknowledged a mild headache, but said she felt strong overall. Her self-assessment did not match what Furba had observed during the ascent. They descended to base camp that afternoon, and Maya spent the evening editing video footage on her laptop. The content she posted later showed dramatic angles of the route and brief clips of herself climbing, but did not mention Sherpa or acknowledge the extended time required to complete what should have been a straightforward acclimatization rotation. Other Sherpas at base camp mentioned seeing her posts and noted the pattern that many clients followed, documenting their own achievement while rendering their guides invisible. The second rotation to Camp 2, at approximately 21,300 feet, began on July 6th. The route required crossing a steep ice face and navigating crevasse fields, gaining roughly 1,600 vertical feet from Camp 1. Maya's performance deteriorated noticeably. Her pace slowed to 30 steps, followed by extended rest breaks, her breathing rapid and shallow even during pauses. Sherpa monitored her closely and noted that her coordination seemed impaired. She fumbled with carabiner gaits, struggled to clip into fixed ropes efficiently, and moved with the kind of clumsiness that suggested her body was not adapting well to altitude. At Camp 2, Maya appeared exhausted in ways that concerned Sherpa beyond normal acclimatization fatigue. Her face remained flushed despite the cold. Her speech came slowly, and she sat down in the snow without organizing her gear or helping to prepare the tent. Sherpa checked her oxygen saturation and found it had dropped to 72%. He explained carefully that declining numbers suggested her body was struggling to adjust, and that continuing upward with deteriorating acclimatization increased the risk of pulmonary or cerebral edema. Maya's response was immediate. She had paid $72,000 and trained hard for this climb. Other expedition members were continuing their rotations on schedule, and she expected the same support. Sherpa attempted to explain that oxygen saturation measurements were objective physiological data, unrelated to determination or payment. But Maya ended the conversation by stating she would discuss any concerns with Tariq directly. That evening, Maya radioed base camp to complain that Sherpa was being overly cautious and undermining her confidence. Tariq supported Sherpa's assessment, but noted that the final decision to continue belonged to Maya as long as she remained physically capable and understood the risks. The compromise involved an additional rest day at Camp 2 before attempting Camp 3. The climb to Camp 3 on July 10th exposed the full extent of Maya's inadequacy. The route ascended a steep section of the Abruzzi Spur, requiring sustained climbing on fixed ropes over blue ice and rock at angles approaching 50 degrees. Maya required 9 hours and 40 minutes to reach Camp 3 at 23,300 feet. Sherpa remained with her throughout, watching her stop every 25 feet, her legs trembling between efforts, her breathing so labored she appeared to be hyperventilating. Around 22,800 feet, Maya stopped moving for nearly 15 minutes without explanation. She stood clipped to the fixed rope, staring at the slope above her without attempting to climb. When Sherpa asked if she could continue, her response came slowly and without the sharpness that had characterized earlier interactions. The delayed processing matched cognitive slowdown Sherpa had seen in clients developing serious hypoxia. At Camp 3, Maya collapsed into her tent without helping to organize gear. Sherpa checked her oxygen saturation and found it had dropped to 68% without supplemental oxygen, a concerning sign given the relatively short time spent at that altitude. He radioed Tariq immediately and stated that Maya needed to descend. Her oxygen levels combined with confusion and coordination, problems suggested early cerebral edema, and waiting for symptoms to worsen would make descent impossible. Tariq asked to speak with Maya directly. The radio conversation occurred with Sherpa present, and Maya insisted she felt fine despite obvious evidence otherwise. She acknowledged the climb had been difficult, but attributed this to normal altitude effects. She planned to rest and descend the following morning as part of the standard rotation cycle. Tariq accepted this plan with the condition that Sherpa monitor her closely overnight and initiate immediate descent if her condition worsened. Maya descended the next day, but the following week at base camp revealed she had not recovered. She lost visible weight, moved slowly between tents, and showed fatigue that rest did not improve. Sherpa raised concerns with Tariq twice more, but each time Tariq deferred to Maya's insistence on continuing, citing acceptable oxygen readings at base camp and the absence of acute symptoms. The weather window opened on July 18th. Forecasts predicted a brief period of reduced winds and clear skies beginning July 20th. Expeditions across base camp finalized summit plans, and Maya insisted on joining, despite showing no improvement in her physical condition. If anything, she appeared weaker than during previous rotations, but her determination remained fixed. The push toward summit began on July 19th. Maya moved through the lower camp's undepleted reserves, her pace mechanical and her focus distant. At Camp 4 at 26,000 feet on July 20th, Sherpa checked her oxygen saturation one final time before the summit push. With her mask sealed and flow set at 4 liters per minute, her reading hovered at 65%, dangerously low and indicating her body was barely processing oxygen even with supplemental support. Sherpa made his final attempt to prevent what he knew would happen. He sat beside Maya in her tent while wind hammered the fabric and explained what the numbers meant. Her body was not adapting. The summit remained 3,000 vertical feet above them, and every step higher would worsen her hypoxia. If cerebral swelling progressed, she could lose coordination and consciousness above 27,000 feet, where rescue was impossible. He asked her directly to descend while she still possessed the physical capacity. Maya's response came without hesitation. She had invested $72,000 and trained for months. She had followers expecting summit content. She was continuing, and Sherpa could either support that decision or she would request different support. The threat was delivered calmly, which made it more disturbing than anger would have. The summit push departed Camp 4 at 11 p.m. on July 20th. Maya climbed with Sherpa directly ahead, and a younger assistant Sherpa, Dawa, behind. Temperatures with wind chill dropped below -30 degrees Fahrenheit, but skies remained clear and winds manageable. For the first 2 hours, Maya maintained pace on the fixed ropes, her oxygen flowing at 4 liters per minute and her layers holding warmth. Above 27,000 feet, deterioration became undeniable. Maya's rest stops extended from 30 seconds to 3 minutes, then longer. Her responses to simple questions slowed and arrived incomplete, as if her brain needed extra time to assemble basic thoughts. Her breathing developed a wet, rattling quality that suggested fluid was accumulating in her lungs as effort and altitude overwhelmed her respiratory system. By 28,000 feet, with roughly 1,250 vertical feet remaining to the summit, Maya had stopped making meaningful progress. She would climb 20 feet, then stop for 5 minutes or longer, her head dropping as if she were falling asleep while standing. Other climbers passed them where terrain allowed, and the turnaround time Sherpa had established, 2 a.m. regardless of position, came and went while they remained far below the summit. Sherpa told Maya they were turning around immediately. She did not respond. He repeated the warning with greater urgency, but Maya showed little comprehension. When he stepped in front of her to block the route upward, she pushed past him with uncoordinated strength, her movements impulsive and erratic. Sherpa and Dawa tried to physically turn her around, guiding her hands to the lower rope and setting her boots into the descent track. But she resisted and continued climbing upward, fixated on reaching the summit. What followed was nearly an hour of struggle with a client who had ceased rational function. They could not carry her down against her will without risking all 3 falling. They could not restrain her without turning a steep fixed rope route into a fight for balance. They could not call for rescue because helicopter operations were impossible at that altitude. At approximately 3:15 a.m., Maya unclipped her safety tether from the short rope connecting her to Sherpa, and clipped only to the fixed line. She continued climbing alone, moving slowly upward while Sherpa shouted warnings that the wind carried away. Sherpa followed at a distance, unable to abandon a client, but unable to physically prevent her from continuing. His own hypoxia was worsening, and Dawa was showing signs of exhaustion that suggested they were approaching their own limits. At 28,400 feet, Maya collapsed. She sat down in the snow and did not stand back up. Sherpa reached her within minutes and found her unconscious, her breathing shallow and irregular, her body unresponsive to verbal commands or physical stimulation. Her oxygen mask had slipped partially off her face, and her regulator showed flow, but the seal was broken. He reseated the mask and increased the flow rate, waiting for any sign of improvement. None came. Within minutes, her breathing became faint and difficult to detect. Sherpa checked for a pulse through thick gloves, but could not find one he trusted. At 28,400 feet, judgment blurred by exhaustion and hypoxia, certainty was impossible. What he knew was that she was no longer responding, no longer assisting, and no longer able to descend under her own power. He made the only decision he could. Clipping her harness to his own, he began attempting to lower her down the fixed lines in short, controlled sections. If there was any chance she was still alive, descent was the only treatment that mattered. Her body hung slack against the rope system, offering no help with foot placements or balance. The effort required strength the altitude had already stripped from him, and after 15 minutes, he had moved her less than 50 feet. Her limbs remained limp. Her chest showed no visible movement. His own vision began to narrow, and he understood that continuing much longer would mean 3 bodies on the slope instead of 1. During one transition between anchor points, Sherpas' crampon caught on the fixed rope buried under fresh snow. The sudden resistance pitched him sideways, and he fell violently onto the slope, his hip striking rock beneath the snow with enough force that he felt something give. Pain detonated through his left side as he slid briefly before the rope arrested his fall. He tried to stand but could not. His left leg would not bear weight, and any attempt to move sent sharp waves through his pelvis and knee. Dawa reached him and radioed again for help. Hours later, as summit teams began descending from above, 2 Sherpas encountered them by chance and stopped. They checked Maya directly, removing her glove, clearing frost from her face, and assessing for pulse and breath without the distortion of panic or motion. There were none. They confirmed what the mountain had already decided. Maya Rodriguez had died high on the slope of K2, most likely from advanced high-altitude cerebral edema, compounded by hypothermia in -40-degree conditions. Sherpas' injuries required immediate evacuation, and the decision was made to focus on getting the living down before the weather deteriorated. The descent took 11 brutal hours over steep technical terrain. Sherpas was lowered to base camp, then airlifted to Skardu, and transferred to Islamabad for emergency surgery. Doctors confirmed a complex hip fracture and severe ligament damage that ended his high-altitude guiding career permanently. Months later, he returned to Nepal and opened a small trekking lodge using compensation and community support. Maya's body remained on K2, recovery deemed too dangerous at that altitude. Her final post from Camp 4, uploaded hours before the summit push, showed her smiling in her down suit. It received more than 240,000 interactions. On February 14, 2016, the Longs Peak trailhead was frigid, with strong winds at the summit and gusts expected to rise. Recent heavy snowfall had raised avalanche danger, with limited daylight and a chance of afternoon snow squalls. Juaima Hanalili pulled into the parking lot as her headlights cut through the pre-dawn darkness. At 28, she had built something remarkable from nothing, a TikTok following that tuned in to watch her make the impossible seem accessible. What had started as weekend hiking posts from her Boulder apartment had evolved into her full-time career, complete with sponsorship deals and the constant pressure to produce content that would keep her audience engaged. The parking lot held only 2 other vehicles, their windshields already frosted over in the frigid air. Juaima methodically laid out her gear on the tailgate of her Subaru, the ritual familiar from dozens of previous climbs. Her 35-pound pack contained everything she might need for an emergency bivouac: sleeping bag, bivy sack, extra food, and layers upon layers of technical clothing. She had been planning this solo winter ascent of Longs Peak for 6 weeks, studying weather patterns, route conditions, and timing her attempt for the most favorable forecast window. The mountain loomed invisible in the darkness above her, its 14,259-foot summit hidden somewhere in the star-filled sky. She had climbed Longs Peak 3 times before, but never in winter, never alone, and never with the added complexity of documenting the experience for her followers. Her recent contract with a major outdoor gear company required monthly high-engagement alpine content, and winter mountaineering videos consistently performed better than her summer hiking posts. She pressed record on her phone, propping it against her bumper to capture herself with her gear spread out behind her. "Good morning, adventurers," she said quietly, mindful of the early hour. "It's Valentine's Day, and I'm about to give myself the ultimate gift, a solo winter summit of Longs Peak. The forecast looks perfect, and I've been training for this moment for months." She talked through her gear selection, explaining each piece of equipment to her audience with the enthusiasm that had made her videos so popular. The pre-recorded content would post automatically when her followers would be checking their phones over morning coffee. She shouldered her pack and began hiking into the darkness, her headlamp beam dancing across the packed but icy trail. The Longs Peak Trail was one of Colorado's most popular routes, but in February she had it almost entirely to herself. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of her microspikes on the frozen ground and the steady rhythm of her breathing in the thin air. The first 3 miles passed quickly as she warmed up, her body generating heat despite the frigid temperature. She had started fast, faster than her planned pace, but felt strong and confident. The trail was well packed from previous hikers, making navigation straightforward even in the darkness. She passed familiar landmarks, the junction with the Storm Pass Trail, the wooden bridge over Alpine Brook, the gradual steepening as the trail began its serious ascent toward treeline. She had reached approximately 11,500 feet, where the last stunted pines gave way to open alpine terrain. Dawn was breaking over the eastern plains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that made her pause despite the cold. The temperature had dropped to 3 degrees, and she could feel the wind for the first time, a steady presence that hadn't been noticeable in the shelter of the trees. She stopped to add her insulated jacket and switched to heavier gloves, then set up her phone to capture the sunrise with the vast expanse of Mountain National Park spread out below her. The footage was spectacular, exactly the kind of content her sponsors loved and her followers devoured. She posted it immediately, adding her location and a few encouraging words about pushing boundaries and embracing challenges. Within minutes, likes and comments began appearing, even at this early hour. Her audience was global now, and somewhere in the world, people were always awake and scrolling. The terrain above the treeline was dramatically different from the forested approach. Here, the landscape was stark and windswept, dominated by massive granite boulders and patches of wind-scoured snow. The trail became less obvious, marked primarily by cairns, stacks of rocks that guided hikers toward the technical climbing route. Juaima had studied this section extensively, but seeing it in winter conditions was different from the summer photos she had memorized. Many of the cairns were partially buried in snow, and the familiar landmarks looked alien under their white coating. She reached Boulder Field, a vast expanse of house-sized granite blocks, at 12,760 feet. This was the last relatively sheltered area before the route became truly technical, and she used the opportunity to make critical gear changes. Off came her hiking boots, replaced by rigid mountaineering boots that would accept crampons. She added another insulation layer and switched to her technical shell jacket, designed to handle the wind and weather she would encounter on the exposed upper mountain. The wind had increased noticeably, sustained at around 30 miles per hour with stronger gusts that required her to brace against her trekking poles. She checked her phone and found no cellular service, expected at this elevation and location. Her GPS showed she was 30 minutes ahead of schedule, which pleased her. The faster pace would give her a buffer for the technical sections ahead and ensure she had plenty of time for the descent. She passed through the keyhole, a distinctive notch in the ridgeline that marked the transition from hiking to mountaineering. The moment she stepped through the gap, the wind hit her with full force. On the protected east side of the mountain, the wind had been manageable. Here on the exposed west face, gusts were strong enough to stagger her, and she had to lean into her ice axe for stability. The route ahead was laid out before her like a vertical roadmap. The ledges, a series of rock shelves requiring scrambling, the trough, a steep snow-filled gully, the narrows, an exposed traverse with 1,000-foot drops, and finally, the home stretch, the steep granite slabs leading to the summit. From her position at the keyhole, the summit looked deceptively close. She estimated 2.5 hours to reach the top, which would put her there well within her planned turnaround time. The ledges section required careful route finding across a series of rock shelves and short cliff bands. In summer, this was straightforward scrambling, but winter conditions had transformed it into something more serious. Snow and ice covered many of the handholds, and she had to test each placement carefully before committing her weight. The exposure was significant. A fall here would likely be fatal, but the moves were within her ability level. She paused on a particularly photogenic section to set up her phone on a small tripod, capturing footage of herself, traversing a narrow ledge with the vast landscape spread out behind her. The shot required several attempts. The wind kept knocking over her phone, and she wanted to ensure the lighting was perfect. The delay added time to her timeline, but the content would be worth it. Her followers expected high production values, and she had built her brand on delivering exactly that. She began ascending the trough, a steep couloir that represented the most technically demanding section of the route. The gully was filled with hard-packed snow and ice, requiring her to kick steps into the slope while using her ice axe for balance and security. The angle was steep enough that a fall would be difficult to stop, but not so steep as to require ropes or advanced technical skills. The wind was funneling through the gully, creating a venturi effect that increased its speed and dropped the effective temperature to around -15 degrees. Her goggles fogged repeatedly from her exertion, forcing her to stop and clear them every few minutes. At 13,500 feet, she was breathing hard despite her excellent fitness, the thin air making every step an effort. The trough was a place where many climbers turned back, intimidated by the exposure and technical difficulty. Juaima felt the challenge, but also felt confident in her abilities. She had trained extensively on similar terrain, and her movements were efficient and controlled. Each step was deliberate, each placement of her ice axe calculated for maximum security. She had completed the trough and emerged onto the narrows, a horizontal ledge traverse that was perhaps the most psychologically challenging section of the entire route. The ledge was narrow, covered in verglas, a thin coating of ice that made every step treacherous. To her left, the mountain rose in steep granite walls. To her right, the world dropped away for more than 1,000 feet to the valley floor below. The wind was violent here, unobstructed by any terrain features. Gusts hit her with enough force to threaten her balance, and she found herself crouching and waiting for lulls before moving across the more exposed sections. One particularly strong gust nearly knocked her sideways, and she pressed herself against the rock wall until it passed, her heart racing from the close call. She realized she was now behind schedule, not dangerously so, but enough to notice. The technical sections were taking longer than anticipated, partly due to conditions and partly due to her methodical approach to safety. She could see the summit plateau above her, tantalizingly close, at only 500 vertical feet away. The decision to continue felt obvious. She had come too far and invested too much to turn back now. She reached the base of the home stretch, the final pitch to the summit. In summer, this was a straightforward scramble up granite slabs. In winter, it was transformed into something more serious, with snow and ice patches covering many of the holds and obscuring the route. She could see other climbers' tracks in the snow, evidence that others had successfully completed this section in recent days. The summit plateau was visible above her, a relatively flat area that marked the end of the technical climbing. She made the decision to continue despite being 90 minutes behind her planned schedule. The weather was still holding, visibility remained good, and while the wind was strong, it wasn't getting worse. She told herself she would be quick on the summit and could make up time on the descent. The final pitch required careful route finding and precise footwork. Each move had to be calculated, each handhold tested before committing her full weight. The granite was solid, but the thin coating of ice made everything more difficult. She climbed steadily, methodically, her focus narrowed to the immediate task of finding the next secure placement. Juaima Hanalili stood on the summit of Long's Peak, achieving everything she had hoped for, a personal milestone, and content that would captivate her audience. The view was spectacular, with the entire front range of Colorado spread out below her and the Great Plains stretching to the eastern horizon. The wind was sustained at over 40 miles per hour, but the visibility was still good, and she felt a surge of accomplishment and joy. She set up her phone to record her summit video, but the wind made filming challenging. It kept knocking over her phone, and the audio was distorted by the constant roar. She tried multiple takes, wanting to capture the moment properly for her followers. The summit video was crucial content. It would be the centerpiece of her social media posts, and likely generate significant engagement. She spent time on the summit, longer than planned but necessary to get usable footage. She ate a protein bar and drank water, trying to refuel for the descent. To the west, she noticed clouds building over the continental divide, but they still looked distant and non-threatening. The weather forecast had called for clear skies until mid-afternoon, and she felt confident she had time to descend safely. She began her descent, immediately discovering that down-climbing the home stretch was significantly more difficult than the ascent. Facing outward, she couldn't see her footholds clearly, and the angle felt steeper and more exposed. She moved very slowly, testing each placement and using her ice axe for additional security. The process was nerve-wracking and time-consuming. By the time she reached the Narrows, conditions had changed dramatically in the short time she had been on the summit. A cloud layer had moved in with surprising speed, dropping visibility to approximately 100 feet. The temperature felt like it was dropping, and the wind seemed stronger. She was beginning to feel the first signs of fatigue and cold in her fingers, despite her heavy gloves. The traverse across the Narrows in limited visibility was a different challenge entirely from the ascent. She had to move by feel and memory, unable to see more than a few feet ahead. The psychological pressure was intense. She knew the exposure was there, even if she couldn't see it. Each step required complete focus and commitment. She re-entered the trough for the descent, and this was where conditions began to deteriorate rapidly. Light snow had started falling, and visibility in the couloir was now severely limited. The descent required facing into the slope and down climbing carefully, a technique more physically demanding than the ascent. Fatigue had set in, and her movements were less precise. About halfway down the trough, she dislodged a crampon placement and slid 15 feet before managing to self-arrest with her ice axe. She wasn't injured, but the incident shook her confidence and made her realize how quickly things could go wrong. She took several minutes to regain composure, checking her gear and reassessing her situation. She exited the trough and was back on the ledges, but the conditions continued to worsen. Snow was falling steadily, and the wind had increased to what felt like 50+ mile-per-hour gusts. She was shivering despite her layers and realized she was significantly behind schedule. Limited visibility and fatigue made route finding difficult, and cairns that had guided her ascent were now buried or obscured. Still navigating the ledges, she made a critical navigation error in the whiteout conditions, following what appeared to be a trail that led to a dead-end cliff band. Backtracking 200 feet cost her precious time and increased her anxiety. She now recognized she was in a serious situation, with deteriorating weather, fading daylight, and her position still far from the relative safety of the keyhole. She considered her options: continue the descent in increasingly dangerous conditions, or find shelter and wait out the storm. She decided to push for the keyhole, aiming to reach the more protected east side of the mountain to reassess and potentially continue down to treeline. Approaching the keyhole, visibility had deteriorated to near whiteout conditions. The temperature had dropped sharply, with wind chill approaching -20. She moved by memory and instinct, more than clear route finding, feeling her way across the familiar terrain. Her GPS had died in the cold, and her phone was down to 12% battery with no service. She was shivering continuously now, an early sign that her body was struggling to maintain its core temperature. The combination of exertion, altitude, and cold was taking its toll. Her decision-making was becoming impaired, though she didn't fully recognize it at the time. Civil twilight arrived, and light began fading rapidly under the storm clouds. Juaima had not reached the keyhole. In the whiteout conditions, she had become disoriented and drifted approximately 150 feet north of the correct route, now on steeper and more exposed terrain. She didn't realize her navigation error. In the limited visibility, the terrain all looked the same. She was moving very slowly, testing each step carefully, but her judgment was increasingly impaired by cold and exhaustion. The wind was constant and brutal, cutting through her layers and sapping her body heat faster than she could generate it. Full darkness arrived, and Waima was forced to rely on her headlamp. The light reflected off the falling snow, making navigation even more difficult. She was still trying to descend, but was now on unfamiliar terrain. Realizing she was lost and facing deteriorating conditions, she made a critical decision: stop moving and seek shelter until morning, or until the storm cleared. She found a small depression between boulders at high elevation on the exposed northwest face of the mountain. It wasn't the protected boulder field she had been aiming for, but it offered some shelter from the wind. The depression was just large enough to deploy her emergency bivy sack. Juaima wedged herself into the rock shelter and crawled inside the bivy with her pack. The sack provided a vapor barrier to help retain body heat, but offered limited insulation against the extreme cold. She was already hypothermic, though she didn't recognize the symptoms. Her core temperature had dropped significantly, and she was shivering violently. The wind continued at 40 to 50 miles per hour with higher gusts, and even in the partial shelter of the rocks, she couldn't fully escape its effects. The bivy sack flapped and allowed cold air infiltration, and the wind chill remained around -20 degrees. She attempted to warm herself by eating high-calorie food and drinking from her water bottle, but her water had already begun to freeze. She had approximately 800 calories of food remaining and 16 ounces of liquid water, resources that would normally be adequate for an emergency bivouac, but not in these extreme conditions. At 13,100 feet in -20-degree wind chill, her body was losing heat faster than it could generate it, even inside the bivvy. She was burning 400 to 500 calories per hour, just trying to maintain her core temperature. Several factors were working against her survival. Her base layers had absorbed sweat during the ascent and were now damp, conducting heat away from her body 25 times faster than dry clothing would have. The wind penetration through her shelter created convective heat loss, and the snow-covered rock beneath her conducted heat away from her body, despite her sleeping pad. At 13,100 feet, the air contained approximately 40% less oxygen than at sea level, making her body less efficient at generating heat and impairing her judgment. She was also becoming dehydrated as her remaining water froze, and dehydration impaired her body's ability to maintain core temperature. Juaima's core temperature dropped from 95 degrees to approximately 90 degrees, moderate hypothermia. Her violent shivering began to subside and then stopped entirely, a dangerous sign that her body was conserving energy for vital organs. She became increasingly lethargic and confused, her thinking clouded by the physiological effects of hypothermia. She attempted to use her phone several times, hoping to get a signal or at least record a message, but the device died completely due to cold-induced battery failure. The loss of her phone eliminated any possibility of calling for help or leaving a record of her location. Her core temperature continued to drop to approximately 86 degrees. Severe hypothermia. She was no longer making rational decisions, her brain function impaired by the extreme cold. She stopped trying to stay active or generate heat, instead lying still in her bivy sack as her body's systems began to shut down. Her heart rate and breathing slowed as her body entered the final stages of hypothermia. In a phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing, common in severe hypothermia cases, she began to feel hot and started removing clothing. She partially unzipped her bivy sack and jacket, actions that accelerated her heat loss but felt necessary to her confused mind. Her core temperature dropped below 82 degrees. Her heart developed arrhythmias as the cold affected her cardiac function. Her breathing became shallow and irregular, and she lost consciousness as her brain function deteriorated. Her heart stopped sometime during the night. The storm continued, depositing an additional 8 inches of snow that further obscured her position, already off the main route and hidden among the granite boulders of the northwest face. Juaima's parents, who had expected a call or text by the previous evening, reported her overdue to the National Park authorities. Her car was quickly located at the Longs Peak trailhead, confirming she had attempted the climb. Rangers noted the severe weather conditions that had moved through the area and began search planning, though active searching was delayed due to continued high winds and poor visibility. After weather conditions improved enough to allow safe search operations, a ground team located Juaima's body approximately 150 feet north of the standard keyhole route at 13,100 feet elevation. She was found in a small rock depression, partially covered by snow, inside her bivy sack with her jacket partially unzipped. The country coroner determined the cause of death to be hypothermia due to environmental exposure, with no traumatic injuries. The time of death was estimated during the night. The death was classified as accidental, with contributing factors including solo winter mountaineering, navigation error leading to inadequate shelter location, and being caught out after dark in severe weather conditions. The Khumbu Icefall runs roughly 2,000 feet of moving glacier between 17,600 feet and Camp 1. Seracs the size of office buildings, crevasses that drop 100 feet into nothing, and no warning before either kills you. Every season it takes people. The rule is simple and repeated to every climber without exception. Cross early, cross fast, cross without stopping. Reva Harlow Chu stopped 3 times. She was 44. A former wealth manager from Greenwich who had first built a financial advisory practice inside her ex-husband's private equity firm, then rebuilt it from scratch after their divorce. Though she left the marriage with enough to retire, she chose to keep working. Her Instagram focused on travel and achievement, projecting a polished, aspirational life. She had two daughters, 16 and 13, who lived mostly with their father in Westport. She had summited Kilimanjaro in 2017 and had never used supplemental oxygen at altitude, a decision that would later matter, and one she either misunderstood or believed did not apply to her. If she had rebuilt a career, a following, and a life from scratch after losing everything once, what made her believe the summit would be any different from those other things she had simply willed into existence? She arrived at Everest Base Camp by helicopter, skipping the 2-week trek from Lukla that climbers use to acclimatize. The trek's 10,000-foot gain is physiological preparation that cannot be rushed. Red blood cell production takes time. Adaptation takes time. By flying in, she saved 2 weeks, time that would instead be spent during the summit push. She had paid $400,000 to a boutique Kathmandu outfitter, Summit Prestige Expeditions, for a private guided attempt. Her own Sherpa, videographer, and permitted drone operator. The setup gave her full control over the climb and its documentation, but left decisions within a very small circle. Herself and the man paid to get her to the top and back. Her assigned Sherpa was Tenzing Bote, 38, from Tem village in the Solukhumbu region, a settlement so remote it sits 3 days' walk from base camp. He came from a guiding family. His father had guided, his uncle had guided. He had accumulated 13 Everest summits without losing a client, a record that reflected not luck, but a consistent approach to risk management that prioritized client survival over client satisfaction when the two came into conflict. He had turned down a higher-paying contract with a group expedition to take this private assignment, believing the one-on-one arrangement would be more controlled. His youngest son had just started school in Namche Bazaar. His wife, Dawa, sold yak cheese at the weekly market. The private contract paid more than the group rate. He made the decision based on what seemed, at the time, like sound reasoning. When client survival and client satisfaction come into direct conflict at 28,000 feet, which one does $400,000 buy? In the icefall, Tenzing watched Harlow Chu pause mid-crossing on an aluminum ladder laid flat across a crevasse to tuck a strand of hair beneath her helmet while the videographer framed the shot from the far edge. He did not say anything. He filed it. She stopped twice more for additional footage before they cleared the crossing. They arrived at Camp 1 2 hours behind schedule. A pair of Sherpas from a South African expedition, watching from the ridge above, noted the lone climber pausing during the crossing and discussed it between themselves. Their assessment was that she was a beginner. They were not wrong. At 21,000 feet, the western CDBM is a flat glacial valley cradled between the West Ridge and the Lhotse face, sun-trapped and windless in the mornings, blindingly white in every direction, deceptively serene. Climbers call it the Valley of Silence. The silence is not peaceful in any meaningful sense. It is the absence of everything that might indicate how exposed and how vulnerable you are. At that altitude, with the surrounding walls of Everest, Lhotse, and Nuptse rising on all sides, the place produces a specific kind of calm that experienced climbers have learned not to trust. The body feels better than it should. The risk looks smaller than it is. Harlow Chu loved it there. She stayed an extra half-day for content. Over 2 rest days at Camp 2, fragments of her background surfaced in conversations with the expedition team, the financial practice, the years inside her ex-husband's firm, and the harder years rebuilding outside it. The daughters who appeared in birthday tributes and proud mother captions, but who lived in practice across a distance that the Instagram account could bridge in one direction only. She spoke about the summit the way she spoke about business milestones, in terms of deliverables, in terms of what she intended to show for the effort, the account, the audience, the footage. These were not incidental to the climb. They were, by her own description, part of the point. If the summit is a deliverable and the audience is the measure of success, what happens to the climb when the camera is no longer there to witness it? Tenzing used the rest days for instruction. He asked Harlow Chu to practice crampon technique on a gentle slope above camp, the kind of controlled repetition that builds the muscle memory climbers depend on when their minds are operating at a fraction of sea level capacity. Crampon technique at altitude is not something a person improvises under stress. It has to be automatic, embedded deeply enough that the body executes it correctly when the brain is no longer fully available to supervise. She practiced for 8 minutes, announced she was comfortable, and went to review footage with the videographer. Tenzing made a note in his journal that evening. His wife would later share its contents with investigators. Harlow Chu listened carefully and attentively when she was afraid, and she was not yet afraid. He was correct that the fear had not arrived. What he could not calculate was precisely how little time that left. The Lhotse face begins at roughly 23,600 feet and rises at 40 degrees for approximately 4,000 feet. It is not a snow slope. It is blue glacial ice, the kind of surface that punishes flat-footed technique, that requires front-pointing crampons into the face with each individual step, that offers no margin for inattention and no recovery from bad footwork. Fixed ropes run the length of it, anchored into the ice at intervals, and climbers ascend clipped in. The standard instruction given to any climber approaching the Lhotse face for the first time is simple. Trust the rope, trust the front points, move deliberately, and if something feels wrong, say so before the moment passes. Above 23,000 feet, the body is engaged in a losing war. Red blood cell production cannot fully compensate for the oxygen density at that altitude. The brain receives less of what it requires to function at its baseline, and the deficit compounds with every hour spent at that elevation. The degradation is not dramatic. It does not announce itself with obvious symptoms. Judgment softens at the edges first, not in ways the affected person is typically able to perceive in themselves, and not in ways that produce obvious behavioral signals to outside observers until the deficit has been building for some time. The ability to accurately assess one's own condition is among the first casualties, which means the people who most need to know they are compromised are precisely the ones least equipped to recognize it. On the Lhotse face, Harlow Chu's front points failed to bite during a brief traverse. Her feet skidded on the ice surface. She caught herself on her ice axe by reflex. She was not hurt. She shook for approximately 20 minutes afterward. She told the videographer to delete the footage. She told Tenzing not to mention it. If her body knows something is wrong, badly enough to shake for 20 minutes, why is the first instinct to erase the evidence rather than examine the warning? That night at Camp 3, Tenzing performed a routine check of her oxygen regulator, the device that controls the flow rate of supplemental oxygen from the bottle to the mask. The regulator had been adjusted. At some point during the evening, Harlow Chu had turned the dial without understanding what it controlled, reducing her flow rate from the prescribed setting to something lower. Tenzing reset it and explained the system to her carefully and methodically, walking through each component, each dial, and its function and consequence. He explained what the correct flow rate looked like on the dial and what a reduced flow rate would do to her performance and safety at altitude. She nodded throughout. He explained it again to be certain she had it. She told him she understood. His journal that night recorded that he was not sure she did. The 2019 Everest season had already attracted unusual international attention before the summit window opened. A photograph had circulated globally, a single image showing dozens of climbers queued in single file on the ridge near the summit, strung out like a traffic backup at 28,000 feet. The image was taken near the Hillary Step, a near vertical rock face roughly 40 feet high that sits just below the summit and functions as a bottleneck whenever multiple expeditions attempt the mountain within the same window. The bottleneck forms not because of poor planning by individual teams, but because the viable window for a safe summit attempt is narrow. The mountain has one primary route to the top, and the calendar forces every expedition onto that route simultaneously. When the window opens, everyone moves. Standing in that queue means standing above 26,000 feet, in what climbers call the death zone, while completely stationary. Every minute of inactivity at that altitude accelerates the body's deterioration. Oxygen depletes from the bottles at a rate calibrated for movement, not for standing still in the cold. Core temperature drops without the heat generated by physical exertion. The physiological timeline between the beginning of a queue wait and serious impairment is not a matter of hours. It is minutes compounding against each other in a body with no reserves left to draw on. 11 climbers would die on Everest in 2019. Several of those deaths were connected, directly or indirectly, to time spent stationary in that queue. At base camp, Tenzing reviewed the forecast with the expedition's operations coordinator. The window was projected to run from May 21st through the 23rd, with deterioration expected on the afternoon of the 23rd. His recommendation was a May 21st departure from Camp 4, standard timing, conservative, preserving the maximum possible margin for delays, errors, or emergencies that experienced guides plan for as routine. It was the recommendation any competent high-altitude guide would have made. Harlow Chu wanted May 22nd. She needed a rest day to recover from the acclimatization rotations, and she had a scheduled satellite video call with clients on May 20th she was not willing to reschedule. The operations coordinator approved May 22nd. Tenzing's journal entry that evening noted the arithmetic plainly: one fewer day of margin. Margin at that altitude is not a luxury or a preference. It is the difference between a descent made in controlled conditions and one made in deteriorating ones. He understood what the approval meant. He also understood that the approval had not come from him. When the person responsible for the contract approves the decision that the person responsible for her life has just warned against, who exactly is in charge of this climb? They departed Camp 4 at 11:08 p.m. Standard departure for the Southeast Ridge route is between 9 and 10 p.m., time to summit near dawn, when the mountain is at its most stable, and to begin the descent well before afternoon, weather patterns develop. They were more than an hour behind schedule before they took a single step upward. The temperature was 27 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Wind ran at approximately 23 miles per hour with gusts approaching 35. The Southeast Ridge was occupied that night by at least 6 other teams. By the time Harlow, Chu, and Tenzing reached the balcony at 27,600 feet, approximately 4 hours into the climb, a cluster of headlamps visible above them indicated a growing queue near the south summit and the Hillary Step. The queue both of them had seen documented in photographs was forming again, in real time, directly ahead of them. At the balcony, Tenzing checked Harlow Chu's oxygen tank and ran the calculation he had run many times on previous expeditions: remaining oxygen against flow rate, pace, distance remaining, and estimated queue time above. He ran it twice. The result was the same both times. He told her directly, without softening, at their current pace, with the queue forming ahead, they did not have enough oxygen to reach the summit and descend safely. He recommended turning around immediately while they still had sufficient supply for a controlled descent. She said that she had not spent $400,000 to turn around at the balcony. Tenzing radioed the operations coordinator at base camp. The coordinator, pulled from sleep, instructed him to defer to the client's decision. Tenzing looked at Harlow Chu. He looked at the ridge above. He began climbing. At what point does the investment stop being motivation and start being the reason a person cannot hear the one piece of information that might save her life? By 7:15 a.m., the queue at the Hillary Step was 17 climbers long. Harlow Chu and Tenzing had been stationary for 55 minutes. Standing still above 28,000 feet is not rest. It is the slow withdrawal of everything the body depends on to keep functioning. Oxygen depletes from the bottles at a rate the system was never designed to sustain through extended stationary waiting. Core temperature drops without the metabolic heat that movement generates. The brain, already running on a fraction of its sea-level oxygen supply, already compromised by hours at extreme altitude, begins deprioritizing. The things it deprioritizes first are not motor function. They are judgment, coordination, and the capacity to accurately assess one's own physical and cognitive condition. A person standing stationary in the death zone for nearly an hour may experience no acute sense of distress. The distress is systemic, invisible, and already well advanced before any outward sign appears. A Sherpa from a French expedition positioned just ahead in the queue noticed Harlow Chu first. He observed her unclipping and reclipping her ascender to the fixed rope in a repetitive motion with no apparent purpose, a mechanical looping action that served no goal. He asked Tenzing in Nepali whether she was all right. Tenzing said she was tired. If the person watching her from the outside can see she is not all right, and the person standing next to her says she is tired, at what point does the gap between those two assessments become fatal? A Norwegian climber descending from a summit he had reached 90 minutes earlier squeezed past the ascending queue and paused near Harlow Chu. He noticed that her oxygen mask had lifted on one side, breaking the seal the system requires to deliver the oxygen-enriched mix to her airway. Instead of drawing in supplemental oxygen, she was bleeding warm exhaled air through the gap on each breath, getting none of the supplemental benefit the mask was designed to provide. He tapped her arm and pointed at the mask. She looked at him and adjusted it in the wrong direction, lifting it further from her face. He corrected it himself and informed Tenzing. He would later describe her eyes to investigators as present but delayed, as though the interval between perception and response had stretched well beyond its normal length. Tenzing repositioned the mask correctly and spoke to her slowly, asking her to look at him and tell him how she felt. She said she was fine. She said she wanted the shot from the top. If the last thing she says with full clarity is that she wants the photograph, what does that tell us about which summit she was actually chasing all along? The queue moved. They cleared the Hillary Step, a demanding rope-assisted scramble that requires both technical footwork and upper body strength from climbers already past what their bodies can reliably produce at that altitude. And the summit ridge opened ahead, a narrow spine of snow and rock, approximately 330 feet to the highest point on Earth. The videographer had turned back at the south summit an hour earlier. The section above was beyond his permitted operational range and beyond his body's capacity. He was already descending. He carried no footage of what came next. If the camera that was supposed to document everything has already turned back, who exactly is this final 330 feet for? A Sherpa from a separate expedition, descending from a summit he had reached 40 minutes earlier, passed Harlow Chu on the ridge, the two of them moving in opposite directions on a path barely wide enough for one climber. He observed immediately that she was not front-pointing. She was walking flat-footed, weight distributed as though the surface beneath her were level pavement rather than the downhill edge of a knife-edge ridge at 29,000 feet. Front-pointing on that surface is not a technique preference. It is the only method that creates reliable purchase on the ice. Flat-footed movement at that angle, at that altitude, is a behavioral signal that the brain directing the body is no longer operating with full access to the processing capacity it needs. The same Sherpa noticed Tenzing's hands. At some point during the queue, wait below, Tenzing had quietly reduced his own oxygen flow rate, without announcement, to extend the remaining supply available for Harlow Chu. He had been deliberately inducing the early stages of altitude sickness in himself, incrementally, as a means of buying her additional margin. It was not a decision visible to anyone watching from the outside. It was the decision of a guide who had been overruled at the balcony and was attempting to change the outcome using the only resource remaining under his control. If Tenzing is now physically compromising himself to compensate for every decision she overruled, what happens to the margin he is manufacturing, and to both of them, when it finally runs out? 3 climbers occupied positions around Harlow Chu and Tenzing at the moment it happened. A Sherpa descending from the summit was approximately 33 feet ahead of them, continuing down the ridge. A South Korean climber ascending solo was roughly 50 feet below, moving upward. A second descending Sherpa trailed the first by a short distance. All 3 provided accounts to investigators within 48 hours. The accounts were nearly identical in their description of the sequence. Harlow Chu stopped. She turned around, not to descend, not as a considered decision to reverse course, but in the way a person turns to look at a view, with the body rotating and the gaze going back down the mountain toward the distance below. Tenzing reached for her arm. She stepped back from him, not aggressively, not with any apparent intent. She stepped back the way a person shrugs without meaning to. A loose, unconscious movement, the body shifting without awareness of what it was doing or why. A movement with no self-knowledge behind it. Her left crampon, the one she had tightened herself at Camp 4 after complaining it felt loose. The one Tenzing had rechecked and found adequate but not perfectly seated, caught the fabric of her right gaiter. She pitched forward and to the left. The descending Sherpa ahead of them shouted. He watched Tenzing lunge, both hands going for the rope running between them. The rope snapped taut under the sudden load. The South Korean climber ascending below heard the sound before he saw anything. A crampon on rock, sharp and immediate, followed by the crack of a loaded rope going tight. He looked up in time to see 2 figures, one falling, one dragged, disappear over the edge of the ridge. The fixed rope saved Tenzing. His anchor held, his harness held. He came to a stop against the face, the rope burning through his glove, one hand already losing sensation from the friction and the temperature. Below him, connected by the short rope they had kept between them throughout the push, Harlow Chu hung against the ice. She was not moving. She was alive. He could feel her weight on the line. She was alive. Tenzing, suspended at 28,936 feet with frostbitten hands and a depleted oxygen supply from the flow rate he had reduced during the queue, began hauling her up the face. The first descending Sherpa reversed course and reached him within minutes, taking rope. The second descending Sherpa came back. The South Korean climber ascending below made his way up to the anchor point. 3 people, all of them already at or past the outer limits of what the human body can sustain at that altitude, all of them burning reserves they had needed for their own descents, hauled a limp climber up an ice face by rope in the death zone. There is no adequate scale for what that effort costs at 28,900 feet. The record shows only that they did it. She began responding during the haul, weakly, without coordination. Her legs made movements that approximated an attempt to assist, uncoordinated enough to be of minimal practical help, but present. Her eyes open. She produced sound. One of the assisting Sherpas described it in his witness statement simply as not word. They got her back onto the ridge at 9:52 a.m. She was semi-conscious. Her mask was repositioned and sealed. Her oxygen bottle read empty. There was no more oxygen available anywhere in the group sufficient to sustain her at that altitude for the length of time the descent would require. Tenzing tied her short to his harness, close enough to control her movement, close enough to feel immediately if she went again, and began moving down the ridge. She could shuffle. Each shuffle took between 8 and 10 seconds. The Hillary step descended with a semi-ambulatory climber secured to a guide who was himself operating on frostbitten hands with no supplemental oxygen, took just under 2 hours. 2 Sherpas from other expeditions, both abandoning their own summit attempts, assisted without being asked. At approximately 11:45 a.m. at the South Summit, Harlow Chu lost consciousness. What followed was not a rescue in the sense of a word that implies a known outcome toward which people are actively working. It was a procession. Tenzing and 3 Sherpas who had assembled around the crisis carried her body down the southeast ridge toward Camp 4. She was no longer a climber. She was a weight. She was a person that the men carrying her were not yet willing to leave on the mountain. Every person in that procession was operating on a deficit they would spend weeks recovering from. The frostbite accumulating on Tenzing's hands, the oxygen depletion compounding across all 4 of them, the muscular expenditure of the ascent, the haul, and now the additional effort of carrying an unconscious person's weight down terrain that does not become less technical on the descent. There is no scale in any official record for what that effort costs on that specific ridge at that elevation. There is only the record of who did it, and for how long. A rescue team dispatched from Camp 4 with fresh oxygen reached them at 3:20 p.m. They administered supplemental oxygen, checked vitals, and did everything that could be done at that altitude with the resources available to them. Riva Harlow Chu was pronounced dead at approximately 4 p.m. at roughly 26,200 feet on a slope facing the valley she had flown over by helicopter 6 weeks before. The summit had been 98 feet away. Tenzing Bode was evacuated by helicopter from Camp 2 the morning after Harlow Chu's death. He had sustained grade 2 frostbite on 3 fingers of his right hand and was in the early stages of pulmonary edema. He spent 11 days in a Kathmandu hospital. He spoke to no press. He returned to Tem. He did not take guiding work during the following season. Riva Harlow Chu was 44 years old. She left behind 2 daughters, ages 16 and 13, who lived in Westport, Connecticut, with their father. In the folds of her jacket during the carry-down, Tenzing found a photograph printed on paper and folded one. A picture of her daughters she had carried from base camp through every camp on the mountain. He had seen it before the summit push. He did not include any reference to it in the accounts he gave to investigators. Some details do not belong to the official record. The summit was 98 feet away. It was April 22, 2017, and the afternoon sun at Everest Base Camp had softened the glacial moraine into a patchwork of gray slush and exposed rock. The temperature sat around 30 degrees Fahrenheit, mild by Khumbu standards, with a steady wind that carried the smell of cooking fuel and damp nylon across the sprawling tent city. Prayer flags hung in dense lines between cairns, their colors bleached by seasons of ultraviolet light. The camp spread across the uneven glacier in clusters organized by expedition company, each group separated by trails of boot-packed ice and the invisible boundaries of liability. Among the arrivals that week was a shipment of equipment that drew attention from neighboring expeditions. Multiple duffel bags bearing custom tags were carried by a porter team, nearly twice the size most operators used. So, from the information I found, the gear included a heated sleeping system, a portable shower unit, a satellite communication hub, and enough personal supplies to stock a small camp independently. The equipment belonged to Victoria Ashworth, a 51-year-old British woman who had paid more for her Everest expedition than most people earned in a decade, a whopping $500,000. And I want you to keep that number in your head as this story unfolds. Victoria had built a luxury wellness brand from scratch in her 30s, grown it into a company valued in the tens of millions, and sold it at 48 for an amount that allowed her to redefine what the rest of her life would look like. What followed the sale was a rapid and public transformation. from corporate executive to adventure philanthropist, documented across social media with the production quality of someone who understood branding. She funded expeditions, spoke at charity galas tied to outdoor causes, and positioned herself as a woman, proving that ambition had no expiration date. The content was polished, aspirational, and relentlessly on message. However, I learned that her climbing resume was thinner than the narrative suggested. She had summited Kilimanjaro on a guided luxury safari-style expedition. She had climbed Mont Blanc with a guide and returned by helicopter. 2 years earlier, she had completed a trek to Everest Base Camp, walking, not climbing, and posted about it as a transformative experience that planted the seed for a full summit attempt. She had never been above 20,000 feet under her own power. She had never used crampons on steep ice. She had never spent a night above Camp 2 on any mountain. What she had was money, conviction, and a public narrative that could not accommodate failure. From everything I found on her background, nothing in her climbing history prepared her for what Everest demands above 23,000 feet. The $500,000 she paid to a premium Kathmandu-based operator bought a bespoke expedition package designed for ultra-high net worth clients who wanted the summit experience with every possible support structure in place. The fee included a dedicated 3 Sherpa team assigned exclusively to her, an expedition doctor on standby at base camp connected via satellite, unlimited supplemental oxygen beyond the standard allocation, a custom nutrition plan, and satellite equipment for posting updates throughout the climb. So, I think it's fair to say the package was, in essence, an attempt to engineer certainty on a mountain that offered none. So, I don't know whether to find this funny or frustrating, but Victoria had framed the expedition publicly as a fundraiser for a women's education charity, a cause she supported genuinely, having raised over $200,000 in pledges tied to her reaching the summit. But the charity framing carried a weight that extended beyond generosity. She had announced a summit date on her social channels. Sponsors were watching. Media outlets had been briefed. The narrative was locked in before she set foot on the glacier, and every dollar pledged added pressure to a decision that should have remained flexible. Also, I found out that her lead Sherpa had a pretty impressive resume to his name. Chewang Dorje Lama, early 40s, 10 Everest summits, raised in a village near Namche Bazaar. Chewang was known in the guiding community for 2 things: his patience with difficult clients and his ability to read conditions on the upper mountain with a precision that other guides trusted more than weather forecasts. He had turned clients around on 3 previous expeditions, twice for weather, once for a client showing early signs of cerebral edema at Camp 3. In each case, the client had later thanked him. He was not accustomed to being overruled, but believe me, that changes here. His support team consisted of Ngawang Chuldim, late 20s, 3 Everest summits, known for his speed and strength on the fixed ropes, and Pemba Thendu, early 30s, 4 summits, experience with oxygen management and high-altitude medical emergencies. Together, the 3 Sherpas represented more than 30 combined years of Himalayan experience, a team assembled specifically because the expedition leader recognized that Victoria would need more support than a standard client. Other clients in the expedition later noted that Victoria's Sherpa team was larger than any they had seen, assigned to a single climber. The allocation raised eyebrows. It meant fewer support resources available for the rest of the group, a trade-off that benefited one client at the expense of everyone else. And from what I gathered, that resentment was already building before the first rotation even began. The acclimatization rotations began in late April, and the problems started immediately. The first rotation, through the Khumbu Icefall to Camp 1 at 19,900 feet, took Victoria nearly twice as long as other clients in the expedition. The icefall was a constantly shifting maze of ice towers, ladder crossings over open crevasses, and unstable seracs that groaned and cracked in the warming sun. Climbers moved through it in pre-dawn darkness to minimize exposure during solar heating. Victoria required constant assistance on the ladder crossings. Her crampon placements were uncertain, her balance unsteady, her breathing labored at an altitude where acclimatized climbers moved with relative ease. Chewang stayed within arm's reach the entire way, guiding her feet onto ladder rungs, steadying her on narrow ice bridges, absorbing delays that stretched the team's exposure in the most dangerous section of the route. And I think the part that frustrates me most is that Chewang could already see where this was heading, and nobody with authority would listen. At Camp 2 in the western CDM, Victoria's appetite disappeared. The altitude suppressed her hunger entirely, and despite the custom nutrition plan, she could not force down enough calories to sustain her body's demands. She lost weight visibly over the first 2 weeks. Other climbers at Camp 2 observed that Victoria spent most rest days inside her tent, communicating via satellite with her media team and sponsors rather than resting or eating. The calories her body needed were being replaced by conversations about content schedules and summit timelines. Honestly, priorities like that at 21,000 feet are just hard to understand and make me mad every time I come across them. Her sleep was disrupted by periodic breathing, a common altitude response where the body alternates between rapid breaths and alarming pauses, leaving her exhausted each morning, despite hours in her sleeping bag. Chewang noted the deterioration and communicated his concerns to the expedition leader at base camp through a private radio channel the client could not hear. If you've watched my other videos on Everest expedition dynamics, you know this is exactly when operators should be pulling the plug. The third rotation, to Camp 3 at 23,500 feet on the Lhotse face, confirmed what Chewang already suspected. The Lhotse face was a continuous wall of blue ice rising over 3,700 vertical feet, at angles between 40 and 50 degrees. Climbers ascended on fixed ropes using mechanical ascenders, each step requiring precise crampon placement on surfaces that offered no forgiveness for mistakes. Victoria could not maintain a consistent pace. Her legs trembled after the first 1,000 feet. Her ascender technique was clumsy, requiring Chewang and Ngawang Chuldim to position themselves above and below her on the rope, essentially guiding her body upward through the steepest sections. She reached Camp 3 after 7.5 hours, nearly double the time of the strongest climbers in the expedition, and arrived unable to eat, barely able to speak, her oxygen saturation registering numbers that made Chewang's expression tighten. That evening, Chewang radioed the expedition leader and recommended that Victoria not continue beyond Camp 3. His assessment was direct. Her pace was unsustainable for a summit attempt. Her oxygen consumption was too high, and her physical reserves were insufficient for the demands above 26,000 feet. The recommendation was relayed to Victoria. She refused. She had paid for a summit attempt, and she expected to receive one. She asked the expedition leader whether Chewang could be replaced with someone more supportive of her goals, and I want you to let that sink in for a second, because that part just infuriated me beyond belief when I read it. The question carried the weight of $500,000, enough to fund the operator's entire season. The expedition leader did not replace Chifeng, but he did not support Chifeng's recommendation either. Instead, he offered a compromise. The team would continue to Camp 4 on the South Col, assess Victoria's condition there, and make a final decision about the summit push based on how she responded to the altitude. Chewang accepted the compromise. He did not agree with it. When I found this detail buried in the reports, it just genuinely pushed me over the edge. I have to admit, this is one of the most infuriating stories I've ever had to research on this channel. The push from Camp 3 to Camp 4 revealed the full extent of the problem. Victoria required supplemental oxygen starting at Camp 3, a full camp earlier than the standard protocol, which reserved bottled oxygen for Camp 4 and above. The early start burned through reserves that had been calculated for the summit push. Chewang adjusted the oxygen plan and radioed base camp, requesting additional bottles be carried up by a support team. The request was fulfilled within 12 hours, but the margin that separated a manageable summit attempt from a crisis had narrowed to almost nothing. I remember reading this part and thinking, the crisis isn't coming, it's already here. They just haven't named it yet. Camp 4 on the South Col sat at 26,000 feet on a windswept plateau, littered with the debris of decades of expeditions. Abandoned oxygen bottles, shredded tents, frozen waste, and the occasional shape too still to be anything but human remains. The wind was a constant presence, moderate that evening at around 20 miles per hour, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. Victoria arrived at Camp 4 in the early afternoon, supported by all 3 Sherpas for the final hour of climbing. She could not set up her own tent. She could not prepare her own equipment. And that right there told me everything I needed to know. Pemba Thendu managed her oxygen, food, and hydration while she lay in her sleeping bag, her body announcing, with every labored breath, that it had reached a threshold the money could not push past. The expedition doctor at base camp reviewed her vitals via satellite, heart rate elevated, oxygen saturation dangerously low, even on supplemental flow, reported symptoms consistent with early-stage altitude illness. His recommendation was clear: descend immediately. Victoria received the recommendation via radio and rejected it. A doctor, an actual medical professional monitoring her vitals in real time, told her to come down, and she said no. I still can't wrap my head around that. She stated that she felt better than the numbers suggested, and that she would rest and reassess before the summit push, scheduled for that night. Chewang made one more attempt. He told the expedition leader directly, not through suggestion, not through diplomatic framing, that Victoria should not attempt the summit. Her pace would require her to spend over 14 hours above 26,000 feet. Her oxygen consumption would exceed the supply they carried. The math was simple, and the conclusion was unavoidable. The expedition leader relayed the message. Victoria's response was that she had paid for 3 Sherpas, extra oxygen, and a summit attempt. And she intended to use all of them. And honestly, my frustration just doubles every time I read this part in the articles. But the expedition leader did not override her decision. The summit push began at midnight. The sky was clear, the wind moderate, the temperature approximately minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit. Victoria departed Camp 4 on supplemental oxygen with all 3 Sherpas. Other teams were already on the route above, headlamps visible on the triangular face in a line that stretched toward the balcony. Within the first hour, the problem was visible to anyone watching. Victoria's pace was roughly half the speed of the teams ahead of her. Climbers who had departed after her began passing, a stream of headlamps moving up the fixed ropes while her light barely seemed to change position. One climber from another expedition later recalled glancing back during a rest stop and seeing a single headlamp far below, barely moving, surrounded by 3 others clustered around it. He assumed it was a rescue. It wasn't. It was a summit attempt. When I read that account, it told me everything about how far outside normal this climb had become. Chewang maintained a steady presence beside her, adjusting her pace, monitoring her oxygen flow, watching for the signs he had been trained to recognize. They reached the balcony at 27,600 feet at approximately 5:15 a.m., over 5 hours after departure, roughly 90 minutes slower than the slowest safe pace for a summit attempt. The sun was beginning to light the horizon. Other teams that had departed at the same time were already approaching the south summit. Chewang recommended turning around. The pace was unsustainable. The oxygen consumption at this rate would exhaust their supply before they could complete the descent. Victoria refused. She could see headlamps above. She could see the ridge stretching toward the summit. She was not going back. I need you to understand. This is the 3rd time someone with more experience told her to stop, and 3 times, money won. Above the balcony, the deterioration accelerated. Every 100 feet of elevation required extended rest. Victoria's legs trembled with the effort of supporting her weight on the steep terrain. Ngawang Chuldim and Pemba Thendu took turns supporting her physically, holding her arm to prevent stumbles, positioning her crampons on the fixed rope, carrying her pack to reduce the load on her failing body. The 3 Sherpas rotated through these roles with practiced coordination, but the effort at this altitude was crushing. Each of them was burning oxygen and energy at rates their own bodies could not sustain indefinitely. They reached the south summit at approximately 10:30 a.m., and from the pictures I saw, the view really was extraordinary. The summit pyramid visible above, the Himalayan panorama spreading in every direction under a clear sky. Most teams had already summited and begun descending. The route above was nearly empty. Chewang calculated the remaining oxygen. At Victoria's consumption rate, they had approximately 3 hours of supply. The summit was 1 to 2 hours above them. The descent from the summit back to the South Col took a minimum of 4 to 5 hours for a strong climber. For Victoria, it would take significantly longer. The arithmetic was not ambiguous. Continuing meant running out of oxygen on the descent. He communicated this to Victoria and to the expedition leader via radio. His recommendation was immediate retreat. Victoria's response was that she could see the summit. She had come too far. She told the expedition leader that if Chewang would not take her up, she would unclip and continue alone. Believe me, this is the moment everything changes. I'm warning you now. The rest of the story will be tough to watch. The expedition leader, caught between the Sherpa's judgment and the client's money, instructed Chewang to continue, but to enforce a hard turnaround at 1 p.m., regardless of position. Chewang received the instruction. He did not agree with it, but the alternative, allowing Victoria to continue alone, would almost certainly result in her death within hours. At least with him beside her, there was a chance. And much to my horror, they continued. The climbing above the south summit crossed the narrow cornice ridge and rose toward the Hillary Step, a near vertical pitch of rock and ice that represented the final technical barrier before the summit. Victoria took over 45 minutes to clear the step, her movement slow and mechanical, her crampons scraping on rock rather than biting with precision. Chewang guided her through every move. By the time she reached the summit ridge, it was past noon. The ridge was a narrow spine of snow, with thousands of feet of exposure falling away on both sides into Tibet and Nepal. The wind had increased slightly, but remained manageable. The summit itself was empty. Victoria Ashworth reached the summit of Mount Everest at 12:47 p.m. on a clear afternoon. She stood at 29,032 feet, while Pemba Thendu took photographs, and she recorded video messages on her satellite device. She spent 11 minutes on the summit. Chewang urged her to begin descending immediately. She asked for more time to capture content. He took her arm and physically turned her toward the descent route. I had to reread that part at least 10 times. Content was still her priority. At 29,000 feet, with oxygen running out, they began descending at approximately 12:58 p.m., already past the 1 p.m. deadline, before they had taken 10 steps downward. The descent from the summit was slow. Victoria moved with the mechanical caution of someone whose body was operating on the last reserves of energy and oxygen her system could provide. Her first oxygen bottle emptied before they reached the south summit. Pemba Thendu switched her to a fresh bottle, one of the last two remaining for the entire 4-person team. The exchange was quick, but every second at this altitude without supplemental flow meant cellular damage accumulating in her brain and muscles. Below the south summit, Victoria's coordination began failing in ways the Sherpas recognized immediately. Her steps became uneven, her crampon placements imprecise. She stopped frequently without awareness that she had stopped, standing motionless on the fixed rope until Chewang touched her shoulder and prompted her forward. Her responses to questions arrived several seconds late, her words slurred and disconnected. Many frequent viewers of this channel must already recognize these horrifying symptoms. By 3 p.m., they were still above the balcony, a position they should have reached an hour earlier. Victoria's second bottle was running low. Chewang made the decision that defined the rest of the descent. He removed his own oxygen mask and fitted his bottle onto Victoria's regulator. The exchange left him without supplemental oxygen at approximately 27,800 feet after a full summit day. He had operated without oxygen at altitude before, briefly during rescues, but never after 14 hours of continuous effort above 26,000 feet. This man gave away his own ability to breathe so she could have a few more hours. I don't have words for that kind of sacrifice. The descent continued. Victoria could no longer walk without being held upright. Her weight pressed down on the Sherpas who flanked her with every step, their bodies absorbing forces that the terrain and altitude amplified beyond what the human frame was designed to handle. At approximately 27,200 feet, on a steep section of fixed rope angled across hard ice, Ngawang Chuldim's right knee buckled. The joint bearing Victoria's weight in addition to his own on a surface that demanded precise foot placement failed with a sensation he would later describe as something inside simply disconnecting. He collapsed onto the rope. Victoria fell with him, her harness catching on the fixed line as her body went limp. Pemba Thendu lunged forward and grabbed her pack strap before momentum could carry both bodies down the face. And to be honest, my hands were shaking when I read that part of the report. Chewang now faced the calculation that every high-altitude guide dreads. One client who could not walk and one team member who could not support weight. He radioed base camp. The response confirmed what he already knew. No rescue team could reach them before morning. They were above 27,000 feet, in darkness that was falling fast, and entirely on their own. I've spent years covering mountain disasters on this channel, and the moments that haunt me most are always the ones where good people run out of options because someone else burned through all of them. Victoria stopped responding to commands. Her breathing became shallow and irregular, each inhalation producing less effect than the last, her body's systems cascading toward failure. Her eyes remained open but did not track movement or respond to light. The presentation was consistent with advanced high-altitude cerebral edema, her brain swelling beyond the point where consciousness could be maintained, pushed past every threshold by a day that should never have begun. Victoria Ashworth died on the fixed ropes at approximately 27,000 feet on the southeast ridge of Mount Everest. The exact time was not recorded. The mountain did not care about the $500,000 she had paid, the sponsors who were watching, or the charity pledges that depended on her summit. It cared only about the physics of oxygen, altitude, and the limits of the human body. Limits that 4 warnings had tried to enforce, and that money had overridden every time, and I hope that line sits with you the way it sat with me. Chiwang and Pemba Thendu, supporting the injured Ngawang Chuldim between them, descended toward Camp 4 through darkness. They arrived after midnight, frostbitten, depleted, and carrying the weight of a death they had tried 4 separate times to prevent. Victoria's body remains on the southeast ridge. Recovery was deemed too dangerous. Ngawang Chuldim underwent knee surgery in Kathmandu, torn ligaments and cartilage damage sustained while bearing a client's weight on steep ice at extreme altitude. At 29, his guiding career was over, which honestly just shatters my heart. Chewang Dorje Lama returned to guiding the following season, but colleagues noted something had shifted. He was quieter, more cautious, more willing to refuse assignments that carried warning signs. He had done everything right on that mountain: warned, recommended, calculated, adjusted, sacrificed his own oxygen. And none of it had mattered. The money had spoken louder than the mountain, right up until the moment the mountain stopped listening. If I ever had to give an example for why money doesn't buy happiness, this story would be my pick.